The ornate golden pen trembled slightly in his weathered hands. After 7 decades of waiting, King Charles III sat alone in the quiet chambers of Buckingham Palace, staring at the document that would officially mark the end of one era and the beginning of another. Outside, London continued its daily rhythm, unaware that their new monarch was about to sign away the last vestiges of his mother's reign and step fully into his own destiny. The royal cipher, those intertwined letters that would appear on everything from postboxes to government buildings, was more than just a symbol. It was the final, irreversible step in a transformation that had begun with his mother's last breath at Balmoral Castle. Westminster Abbey stood silent in the pre-dawn darkness, its ancient stones bearing witness to nearly 1,000 years of royal history. The Gothic spires reached toward a star-filled sky, while inside, preparations were underway for a ceremony that few members of the public would witness, but which would mark one of the most significant moments in the new reign of King Charles III. The ceremony of symbols, as historians would later name it, was not an official state occasion in the traditional sense. Rather, it was a private moment of constitutional and spiritual significance, where the new monarch would formally accept the responsibility of bearing the royal cipher and all that it represented. The ceremony had been planned in secret for years, part of the careful preparation that ensures the monarchy's continuity even in moments of profound change. Dean of Westminster David Hoyle arrived at the Abbey at 4:30 a.m., his footsteps echoing through corridors that had seen the coronations of monarchs dating back to William the Conqueror. At 72, the Dean brought both gravitas and warmth to his role as one of the most senior clerics in the Church of England. He had officiated at Prince Philip's funeral service the previous year, and his understanding of royal protocol was matched only by his sensitivity to the human emotions underlying these grand occasions. The Dean made his way to the sacrarium, the most sacred part of the abbey, where the high altar stood surrounded by medieval tiles that had been walked upon by centuries of monarchs. Here, on a simple oak table that had been specially commissioned for the occasion, lay the items that would be central to the mourning ceremony, the official documents bearing the new royal cipher, rendered in the finest calligraphy by scribes from the Crown Office at the House of Lords. Master calligrapher Patricia Williams had spent 6 weeks creating these documents, using techniques that dated back to the medieval period but executed with a precision that modern technology could not match. Each letter was formed by hand, using inks mixed according to formulas that had been closely guarded secrets for generations. The vellum itself came from sheep raised on the Sandringham estate, connecting even these ceremonial materials to the royal family's personal heritage. The cipher design that would be officially unveiled that morning was the result of months of careful consideration by the College of Arms, the body responsible for heraldic matters in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Garter Principal King of Arms David Vines White had overseen the design process personally, ensuring that every element reflected both historical precedent and contemporary relevance. The final design featured the letters C and are intertwined beneath the Tudor crown, rendered in a style that managed to feel both traditional and fresh. The choice of the Tudor crown, rather than the imperial state crown that had appeared on Queen Elizabeth II's cipher, was significant. The Tudor crown was simpler, more geometric, and reflected King Charles III's known preference for understated elegance over ostentatious display. Sir Clive Alderton had arrived at the Abbey shortly after the Dean, carrying a leather portfolio that contained correspondence from Commonwealth leaders, military commanders, and government officials around the world. Each letter expressed not just condolences on the death of Queen Elizabeth II, but formal recognition of King Charles III's accession and acceptance of his authority as represented by the new royal cipher. The letter from Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was particularly moving, acknowledging both the personal loss felt by the king and the constitutional continuity that his reign represented. Similar messages had arrived from Australia, New Zealand, and other Commonwealth realms, each reflecting the complex relationship between personal monarchy and constitutional democracy that characterized the modern Commonwealth. As dawn approached, a small group of witnesses began arriving at the Abbey. These were not the typical congregation of state occasions. No foreign dignitaries, no members of parliament, no representatives of major institutions. Instead, the witnesses were people whose lives had been touched directly by the monarchy's service. A postal worker from Cardiff who had delivered royal mail for 30 years, a military veteran who had served in the Queen's Guard, a teacher from a school that bore the royal charter, and a nurse from a hospital that operated under royal patronage. Among the witnesses was Thomas Richardson, a master craftsman from the Royal Mint who had spent his entire career producing the coins and medals that bore royal ciphers. At 68, Richardson had worked on commemorative pieces for Queen Elizabeth II's silver, golden, diamond, and platinum jubilees. His weathered hands bore the calluses and small scars that came from decades of precision metalwork, and his knowledge of royal heraldic tradition was encyclopedic. Richardson brought with him the first coin to bear King Charles III Cypher, a simple bronze medal that had been struck just hours earlier in a special ceremony at the Royal Mint in Wales. The medal would not enter general circulation. Instead, it would be placed in the royal collection as a historical marker of the transition between reigns. The weight of the medal in Richardson's hands represented not just craftsmanship, but the continuation of a tradition that stretched back to the earliest days of coinage in Britain. Another witness was Emma Thornfield, a seamstress who had spent 25 years creating and maintaining the ceremonial uniforms worn by royal household staff. Her expertise extended beyond simple tailoring to include the intricate embroidery work that appeared on state livery, military dress uniforms, and court dress. The new royal cipher would soon appear on hundreds of uniforms throughout the royal household, and Thornfield would be responsible for ensuring that every stitch met the exacting standards that such work demanded. Thornfield had brought with her a small piece of silk bearing the new cipher, embroidered in gold thread according to specifications that had been finalized only days earlier. The embroidery represented hours of painstaking work, with each thread placed with mathematical precision to create the illusion of depth and dimensionality. The silk itself was British-made from a mill in Yorkshire that had supplied royal households for 3 generations. The ceremony began at 6 a.m. with a simple prayer offered by Dean Hoyle, asking for guidance and wisdom for the new monarch as he undertook his constitutional responsibilities. There was no fanfare, no organ music, no elaborate ritual. Instead, the focus was on the quiet moment when King Charles III formally accepted the documents bearing his cipher and acknowledged the weight of responsibility they represented. The king wore a simple dark suit, with only a small pin bearing his personal arms to indicate his royal status. His hands, which had signed thousands of documents as Prince of Wales, now signed as monarch for the first time. The signature was firm and clear, showing none of the trembling that had been evident just days earlier when grief was still fresh. As he signed each document, the king spoke briefly about the responsibility he felt not just to continue his mother's work, but to adapt the monarchy to meet contemporary challenges. His voice was steady, but those present could detect the emotion underlying his formal words. This was, after all, not just a constitutional moment, but a deeply personal one, the final step in a transition that had begun with his mother's death. Lord Chamberlain Baron Parker read aloud the official proclamation that would be distributed to every Commonwealth realm, announcing the adoption of the new royal cipher and establishing the timeline for its implementation. The language was formal and precise, following protocols that had been established over centuries, but the meaning was clear. A new reign had truly begun. The artistic director of the Royal Collection, Dr. Caroline Wright, presented a specially commissioned piece of artwork that would hang in Windsor Castle as a permanent reminder of this transition. The piece, created by contemporary artist James Morrison, featured both Queen Elizabeth II's cipher and King Charles III's cipher intertwined in a design that suggested continuity rather than replacement. The artwork used traditional techniques, but incorporated subtle modern elements that reflected the evolution of the monarchy itself. Morrison, who had been working on the piece for months in absolute secrecy, explained his artistic vision to the small gathering. The intertwining of the two ciphers was meant to suggest that each reign built upon its predecessor rather than replacing it entirely. The color palette moved from the deep blues associated with Queen Elizabeth II's reign to the warmer tones that reflected King Charles III's known aesthetic preferences, but the transition was gradual rather than abrupt. The ceremony concluded with the presentation of the first official items bearing the new cipher. Master craftsman Richardson presented the commemorative coin, while seamstress Thornfield displayed the embroidered silk. A representative from the government stationery office presented the first sheet of official letterhead bearing the new cipher, and a delegation from the Royal Mail showed the prototype design for new stamps. Each item represented not just the technical challenge of implementing the new cipher, but the human effort required to maintain the traditions and standards associated with royal symbols. The coin required new dies and new striking procedures. The embroidery demanded new patterns and new techniques for reproducing the cipher at different scales. The letterhead needed new printing setups and new quality control procedures. As the witnesses departed, King Charles III remained in the abbey for a few minutes of private reflection. The morning light was now streaming through the medieval stained glass windows, casting colored patterns across the ancient stones. The ceremony had been brief and understated, but its significance would resonate for decades to come. The new cipher would appear first on official government communications later that same day. Within a week, it would begin appearing on new coins and stamps. Within a month, it would be visible on military uniforms and police equipment. Within a year, it would be ubiquitous throughout British society, as familiar and unremarkable as his mother cipher had been for 7 decades. But that morning, in the quiet of Westminster Abbey, surrounded by witnesses whose lives embodied the practical reality of constitutional monarchy, King Charles III took the final step in accepting not just the crown, but all the symbols and responsibilities that came with it. The ceremony was over, but the work of a new reign was just beginning. The Dean of Westminster offered a final blessing, not just for the king, but for all those who would be touched by his reign. Outside, London was waking up to another day, unaware that in the ancient abbey at its heart, history had quietly turned another page. The age of Charles III had truly begun, marked not by grand proclamations or elaborate ceremonies, but by the simple acceptance of responsibility symbolized in a carefully crafted cipher that would soon become as familiar as the sunrise itself. The logistics center in Birmingham hummed with activity that would have seemed chaotic to an outsider, but which followed a carefully orchestrated plan that had been years in the making. Warehouse manager Janet Morrison stood before wall-mounted charts that tracked the progress of what government officials privately called Operation Transition, the systematic replacement of Queen Elizabeth II royal cipher with that of King Charles III throughout the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. Morrison had spent 32 years managing complex distribution operations, first for major retailers and later for government contracts, but nothing in her experience compared to the scope of this undertaking. The warehouse contained millions of items awaiting distribution. Uniform insignia for police forces across England and Wales, new letterheads for government departments, updated signage for courthouses, and thousands of other items that bore the royal cipher. The scale of the replacement effort was staggering. Conservative estimates suggested that Queen Elizabeth II's cipher appeared on more than 50 million individual items throughout the United Kingdom alone. These range from the obvious, coins, stamps, and postboxes, to the obscure, specialized equipment used by customs officers, ceremonial items in remote parish churches, and decorative elements on government vehicles that most citizens would never notice. Chief Superintendent Michael Thornton of the Metropolitan Police had arrived at the Birmingham facility to oversee the distribution of new uniform insignia to police forces throughout England and Wales. The Metropolitan Police alone employed more than 30,000 officers, each requiring updated badges, buttons, and shoulder insignia. Scotland Yard's uniform branch would be among the first to receive the new items, ensuring that the most visible representatives of law enforcement would properly reflect the new reign. Thornton brought with him detailed specifications that had been developed in consultation with the College of Arms and the Home Office. The new insignia needed to maintain the dignity and authority associated with police uniforms while reflecting the updated royal cipher. The design process had required extensive consultation with rank-and-file officers, whose practical experience highlighted considerations that might have been overlooked by bureaucrats and designers. The challenge was not simply aesthetic, but practical. Police officers worked in demanding conditions that tested the durability of their equipment. The new insignia needed to withstand weather, physical contact, and regular cleaning while maintaining their appearance and legibility. Material scientists had spent months testing different alloys, coatings, and attachment methods to ensure that the new items would meet operational requirements. Sergeant Patricia Welsh, a 30-year veteran of the Birmingham Police Force, had been selected to participate in field testing of the new insignia. Her feedback had been instrumental in refining the designs to ensure they met practical needs. The weight distribution of new shoulder badges, the visibility of updated collar insignia, and the comfort of modified helmet decorations had all been adjusted based on input from officers like Welsh. The military dimension of the replacement effort was even more complex. Colonel James Harrison of the Household Division had coordinated with counterparts throughout the British Army, Royal Navy, and Royal Air Force to ensure that military insignia were updated according to proper precedents and protocol. The Household Division, which provided ceremonial guards for royal occasions, would receive priority for new items, followed by other units based on their visibility and operational requirements. Harrison carried with him prototypes of new insignia for the various ranks within his regiment. The guards' distinctive bearskin hats would receive new plate badges, while their red tunics would sport updated collar insignia and button designs. The precision required for military heraldic work was extraordinary. Each element needed to conform to regulations that had been refined over centuries of military tradition. The manufacturing challenges were considerable. Traditional suppliers of military insignia, many of them small family businesses with decades of experience, had been working around the clock to meet demand. Birmingham-based firm Jennings & Company, which had supplied military insignia since 1856, had hired additional craftspeople and extended their operating hours to accommodate the increased workload. Master craftsman Robert Jennings, whose great-great-grandfather had founded the company, oversaw production personally to ensure that quality standards were maintained despite the increased pace. Each badge required multiple production steps: die casting, polishing, plating, and quality inspection. The royal cipher elements were particularly challenging, requiring precision that could only be achieved by experienced artisans. The Royal Mail faced perhaps the most visible aspect of the replacement effort. Every post office in the United Kingdom displayed the royal cipher prominently, from large sorting facilities to small village sub-post offices. Additionally, the famous red post boxes that dotted the British landscape would eventually require updating, though this would be accomplished gradually over several years. Postal Operations Manager Sarah Bennett coordinated the rollout of new materials to more than 11,000 post offices throughout the country. New uniforms for postal workers, updated vehicles for delivery services, and revised stationery for official communications all required careful scheduling to minimize disruption to mail delivery services. Bennett's team had developed a phased approach that prioritized urban areas and high-traffic locations while ensuring that rural communities were not overlooked. The logistics were complicated by the fact that postal workers needed training on new procedures that accompanied the visual changes, particularly for international mail that might be affected by updated documentation. The replacement of post boxes presented unique challenges. These iconic red cylinders were not simply functional items, but beloved symbols of British culture. Many dated from the Victorian era and possessed historical significance that went beyond their utilitarian purpose. The decision had been made to replace the cipher plates on existing boxes rather than installing entirely new units, preserving the historical continuity while updating the royal symbolism. Metalworker David Fletcher, whose specialty was restoration of historic ironwork, had been contracted to develop techniques for updating the post boxes without damaging their structural integrity or historical character. Fletcher's workshop in the Black Country had become a testing ground for methods that would preserve the Victorian craftsmanship while incorporating 21st century requirements. The international dimension added another layer of complexity. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand were conducting their own replacement efforts, each adapted to local conditions and requirements. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police were updating their uniforms and equipment according to Canadian protocols, while the Australian Federal Police coordinated with state and territorial forces to ensure consistent implementation across the continent. High Commissioner Patricia Williams represented Australian interests in the coordination effort, ensuring that the new Cypher would be implemented smoothly across Australian government institutions. The challenge was particularly complex in Australia due to the federal system, which required coordination between national and state governments, each with their own procedures and timelines. The technological aspects of the replacement effort were managed by government IT specialist Andrew Morrison, who oversaw updates to digital systems that displayed or processed the Royal Cypher. Government websites, official databases, and electronic forms all required modification to reflect the new symbolism. The work was painstaking, involving thousands of individual files and systems that needed to be updated without disrupting ongoing government operations. Morrison's team had developed software tools to automate much of the replacement work, but human oversight was essential to ensure that context-sensitive changes were handled appropriately. Legal documents, historical records, and archive materials required different treatment than contemporary operational systems. The financial implications were significant, but had been planned for over many years. The Treasury had established a dedicated fund for transition costs, recognizing that the expense was both necessary and inevitable. Estimates suggested that the complete replacement effort would cost between £50 and £75 million over 3 years, but the expenditure would be spread across multiple government departments and operational budgets. Treasury official Caroline Wright had been tracking costs since the planning phase began, ensuring that resources were allocated efficiently and that taxpayer funds were used responsibly. The careful scheduling of replacement activities helped minimize costs by allowing items to be updated during normal replacement cycles whenever possible. Small businesses throughout the country were affected by the transition as well. Companies that held royal warrants, official recognition as suppliers to the royal household, needed to update their documentation and promotional materials to reflect their status under the new reign. This represented not just the administrative burden, but an opportunity to renew their commitment to the standards of quality and service that royal warrant status demanded. Harrods department store in London, which had held royal warrants for more than a century, coordinated updates to their signage, uniforms, and official documents. Store manager Elizabeth Fortescue oversaw the process personally, ensuring that the transition reflected both respect for tradition and commitment to continuing excellence in customer service. The educational sector faced its own challenges as schools throughout the United Kingdom needed to update official documents, uniforms, and ceremonial items that bore the royal cipher. This was particularly complex for institutions that had historical connections to the monarchy, such as schools founded under royal charter or those that maintained traditional ceremonies involving royal symbols. Headmaster John Morrison of Winchester College, one of England's most prestigious schools, coordinated updates to school uniforms, ceremonial regalia, and official documents that reflected the school's 800-year history. The challenge was to maintain the institution's traditions while properly acknowledging the change in monarch. By the end of the first month, the replacement effort was proceeding ahead of schedule in most areas. The careful planning, extensive preparation, and dedication of thousands of civil servants, military personnel, and private contractors had ensured a smooth transition that honored both the memory of Queen Elizabeth II and the authority of King Charles III. The sight of police officers wearing updated insignia, postal workers sporting new uniforms, and government buildings displaying revised signage provided daily reminders that a new era had begun. These changes were subtle to most observers. The casual passerby might not immediately notice the difference, but they represented a fundamental shift in the symbolic landscape of British society. In warehouses, workshops, and offices throughout the country, the work continued with quiet efficiency. Each updated badge, each revised document, each new uniform represented not just administrative necessity, but a form of national service, ensuring that the symbols of constitutional monarchy remained current, relevant, and worthy of the respect they had earned over centuries of faithful service to the British people. The morning fog rolled across Sydney Harbor as Governor-General David Hurley stood on the steps of Government House, watching the harbor ferry make its way towards Circular Quay. At 70, Hurley brought both military discipline and diplomatic sensitivity to his role as the Crown's representative in Australia, and the task ahead of him would require both qualities in equal measure. Australia's response to the royal Cypher transition reflected the unique relationship between the continent nation and the British Crown. As a constitutional monarchy with King Charles III as head of state, Australia needed to implement the change throughout its federal system, but the process was complicated by ongoing debates about the monarchy's role in modern Australian society. Hurley had spent weeks consulting with Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and state premiers to ensure that the Cypher replacement would proceed smoothly despite political sensitivities. The challenge was to acknowledge constitutional reality while respecting diverse views about Australia's future relationship with the monarchy. The process needed to be thorough and dignified, avoiding both excessive ceremony and casual dismissal. The Australian Federal Police had already begun updating their uniforms and equipment, following protocols that had been developed in consultation with British counterparts, but adapted to Australian conditions and requirements. Commissioner Rhys Kershaw had overseen the design process personally, ensuring that the new insignia reflected both royal authority and Australian identity. The AFP's tactical response teams, who operated in some of the most demanding conditions imaginable, had field-tested new equipment to ensure it met operational requirements. The feedback from these elite units had influenced design decisions that might have seemed trivial to outside observers, but could mean the difference between success and failure in critical situations. Detective Senior Constable Maria Santos of the AFP's Organized Crime Division had been among the officers selected for field testing. With 15 years of experience in law enforcement, Santos brought practical knowledge about equipment durability, visibility requirements, and operational effectiveness. Her recommendations had led to improvements in the attachment mechanisms for new shoulder insignia and adjustments to the contrast levels on updated collar badges. The Royal Australian Navy faced particular challenges in implementing the Cypher change. Naval tradition placed enormous emphasis on ceremonial precision, and the service's connection to the Royal Navy meant that changes needed to reflect both Australian independence and Commonwealth tradition. Admiral Mike Noonan had coordinated with the Australian Defence Force leadership to ensure that naval ceremonies would continue to meet the exacting standards expected of the service. The Navy's Ceremonial Guard, which performed duties at state occasions and official visits, required updated uniforms that maintained the distinctive appearance that had evolved over more than a century of Australian naval tradition. The sailors selected for ceremonial duties represented the finest examples of naval professionalism, and their appearance needed to reflect the service's commitment to excellence in all aspects of their operations. Chief Petty Officer Andrew Mitchell, a 28-year veteran who had participated in ceremonial duties throughout his career, worked closely with uniform designers to ensure that practical considerations were not overlooked in the pursuit of visual impact. The weight distribution of new ceremonial swords, the fit of updated dress uniforms, and the comfort of modified headgear all required careful attention to detail. In Canada, the implementation process reflected the country's unique constitutional arrangements and cultural sensitivity to symbols of monarchy. Governor-General Mary Simon, herself representing both Indigenous heritage and modern Canadian values, had worked carefully to ensure that the Cypher transition acknowledged Canada's complex relationship with royal symbols. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, one of Canada's most recognizable institutions, faced the challenge of updating uniforms and equipment that were known worldwide. Commissioner Brenda Lucki had coordinated with provincial and municipal police forces to ensure consistency while respecting local variations that reflected regional identities and operational requirements. The RCMP's musical ride, the ceremonial mounted unit that performed at events across Canada and internationally, required particular attention. The horse's tack, the rider's uniforms, and the ceremonial equipment all needed updating while maintaining the traditional appearance that made the musical ride one of Canada's most effective cultural ambassadors. Staff Sergeant Pierre Dubois, who had participated in the musical ride for 12 years, worked with designers to ensure that changes enhanced rather than diminished the visual impact of the performances. The team's red serge uniforms were iconic, and any modifications needed to preserve their distinctive appearance while properly reflecting the new royal cipher. The challenge was particularly complex in Quebec, where attitudes toward monarchy were shaped by historical grievances and contemporary political movements. Provincial authorities had committed to implementing the changes as required by constitutional law, but the process needed to be handled with sensitivity to local concerns and cultural perspectives. Lieutenant Colonel Marie-Claire Bouchard of the Royal 22e Regiment, known as the Vendus, Canada's premier French-speaking military unit, had coordinated with federal and provincial authorities to ensure that the cipher transition reflected both constitutional requirements and Quebec's distinct identity within the Canadian Federation. New Zealand's approach to the transition reflected the country's pragmatic attitude toward constitutional monarchy and its commitment to inclusive representation of all citizens, including the Maori population whose relationship with the Crown predated European colonization. Governor-General Dame Cindy Kiro had worked with Prime Minister Chris Hipkins to ensure that the cipher change acknowledged both constitutional continuity and New Zealand's evolving national identity. The process needed to respect Maori perspectives on Crown authority while meeting the practical requirements of government operations. The New Zealand Defence Force had begun updating uniforms and equipment according to protocols that reflected both military tradition and contemporary New Zealand values. Chief of Defence Force Air Marshal Kevin Short had emphasized that the changes should enhance rather than diminish the distinctive character of New Zealand's military services. The All Blacks rugby team, whose cultural significance in New Zealand extended far beyond sports, wore uniforms that included subtle royal symbols. The New Zealand Rugby Union had worked with designers to ensure that any necessary changes preserved the iconic appearance of the All Blacks uniform, while properly reflecting updated royal symbolism. Captain Michael Thompson of the Royal New Zealand Navy had overseen the service's response to the cipher transition, ensuring that ceremonial uniforms met the exacting standards expected of naval personnel while reflecting New Zealand's unique position in the South Pacific. The Navy's connection to Maori maritime traditions added another dimension to the symbolic considerations involved in the uniform updates. In the smaller Commonwealth realms, the cipher transition presented both opportunities and challenges. Countries like Jamaica, Barbados, and the Bahamas had limited resources for implementing changes, but their commitment to constitutional monarchy remained strong despite ongoing discussions about potential future changes to their government systems. Jamaican Prime Minister Andrew Holness had worked with Governor-General Sir Patrick Allen to ensure that the cipher transition proceeded smoothly despite ongoing constitutional debates. The Jamaica Defence Force had updated their uniforms and equipment according to local procedures while maintaining their distinctive Caribbean character. Commissioner Major General Anthony Anderson of the Jamaica Constabulary Force had coordinated the police response to the cipher change, ensuring that law enforcement uniforms properly reflected royal authority while acknowledging Jamaica's cultural identity and operational requirements. The financial implications of the Commonwealth-wide transition were significant, and the British government had quietly provided assistance to smaller realms that faced budgetary constraints. This support was offered diplomatically, respecting the sovereignty of recipient nations while ensuring that constitutional requirements could be met without imposing undue hardship. Sir David Manning, a former British ambassador who had specialized in Commonwealth relations, had coordinated much of this assistance through established diplomatic channels. The goal was to ensure that all Commonwealth realms could implement the Cypher transition appropriately while respecting their individual circumstances and capabilities. The cultural dimension of the transition was perhaps most complex in nations where colonial history had left complicated legacies. The royal Cypher represented constitutional authority, but it also carried historical associations that different communities viewed differently. The implementation process needed to acknowledge these sensitivities while fulfilling constitutional requirements. Professor Sarah Williams of the University of the West Indies had studied the symbolic dimensions of monarchical authority in post-colonial societies, and her research had informed the approach taken by several Caribbean nations. The challenge was to implement necessary changes while respecting diverse perspectives on the monarchy's role in contemporary society. The technological aspects of the Commonwealth-wide transition required coordination between multiple government systems and private contractors across different time zones and legal jurisdictions. Software updates, database modifications, and communications protocols all needed to be synchronized to ensure smooth operations. Australian IT specialist Jennifer Chun had worked with counterparts throughout the Commonwealth to develop compatible systems that could handle the Cypher transition without disrupting government operations. The technical challenges were compounded by variations in government systems and procedures between different countries. As the transition progressed, it became clear that the process was serving purposes beyond simple symbol replacement. The coordination required between Commonwealth countries was strengthening relationships and improving communication channels that would benefit future cooperation on everything from trade negotiations to security arrangements. The Cypher transition was revealing the Commonwealth as a living institution rather than a historical relic, demonstrating that shared constitutional traditions could provide foundations for contemporary cooperation while respecting national sovereignty and cultural diversity. In capitals across the Commonwealth, government officials, military personnel, and private citizens were discovering that symbols matter more than they might have expected. The process of changing from one royal cipher to another was prompting conversations about identity, tradition, and values that might not have occurred otherwise. The careful attention to detail, the respect for local sensitivities, and the commitment to excellence demonstrated throughout the transition process were themselves statements about the character of the institutions involved. The Commonwealth was showing that it could adapt to change while preserving what was valuable from the past, demonstrating relevance for the 21st century while honoring connections that stretch back centuries. The first snowfall of winter dusted the grounds of Windsor Castle as King Charles III walked through the state apartments, observing the subtle changes that marked the completion of the great Cypher transition. 6 months had passed since that quiet morning at Westminster Abbey, and the transformation was now complete. His mother's initials had been respectfully retired, and his own cipher had taken its place throughout the United Kingdom and across the Commonwealth. The transition had been more than successful. It had been revelatory. What had begun as an administrative necessity had evolved into something approaching a national renewal, demonstrating the enduring relevance of constitutional monarchy in an age when many institutions struggled to maintain public confidence and support. Private Secretary Sir Clive Alderton arrived with the final reports from government departments, Commonwealth countries, and private organizations that had participated in the transition. The statistics were impressive. More than 50 million items have been updated or replaced, involving coordination between hundreds of organizations and thousands of individuals, all accomplished without significant disruption to government operations or public services. The human stories behind these statistics were even more compelling. The transition had provided opportunities for craftsmanship, creativity, and public service that had enriched communities throughout the United Kingdom and beyond. Traditional skills had been preserved and transmitted to new generations, while modern techniques had been adapted to serve timeless purposes. Master engraver Thomas Richardson had completed his final project for the Royal Mint, a commemorative medal that captured both the solemnity of Queen Elizabeth II passing and the hope associated with the new reign. At 68, Richardson had decided that this project would mark his retirement, ending a career that had spanned 5 decades, and for monarchs. The medal represented not just technical excellence, but a lifetime of dedication to the craft traditions that gave physical form to constitutional continuity. Richardson's apprentice, 24-year-old Sarah Mitchell, had learned techniques during the transition project that were not taught in any formal program. The knowledge passed from master to student in the quiet workshops of the Royal Mint represented cultural transmission of the most fundamental kind, ensuring that skills developed over centuries would survive into the digital age. The Royal Collection had acquired several pieces created during the transition that would serve as permanent reminders of this historic period. Artist James Morrison's intertwined Cypher design had been joined by other works that captured different aspects of the transition. A photographic series documenting the replacement of postbox ciphers throughout Scotland, textile samples showing the evolution of uniform designs, and architectural drawings recording the installation of new building decorations. Dr. Caroline Wright, keeper of the Royal Collection, had worked with artists and craftspeople throughout the transition to ensure that the creative achievements it represented were properly documented and preserved. The collection would serve future historians seeking to understand not just what changed, but how the changes were accomplished with such remarkable efficiency and grace. The international dimension had proven particularly successful, strengthening Commonwealth relationships in ways that had not been anticipated. The coordination required for the Cypher transition had led to improved communications protocols, better understanding of different countries' constitutional arrangements, and enhanced appreciation for the diversity within Commonwealth unity. Canadian Governor-General Mary Simon had reported that the process had provided opportunities for dialogue about symbols, identity, and constitutional arrangements that had proven valuable beyond the immediate requirements of Cypher replacement. Similar feedback had come from Australia, New Zealand, and other Commonwealth realms, suggesting that the transition had served as a catalyst for broader conversations about shared values and common institutions. The economic impact had been substantial, but overwhelmingly positive. The transition had provided work for traditional craftspeople, modern manufacturers, and service providers throughout the United Kingdom and Commonwealth countries. Small businesses had received contracts that helped sustain specialized skills and capabilities that might otherwise have been lost to global economic pressures. Birmingham-based military insignia manufacturer Jennings and Company had used the transition project to upgrade their equipment and expand their workforce, positioning the company for growth in international markets. Similar stories had emerged from textile manufacturers, printing companies, and metalworking firms throughout the country, suggesting that the transition had provided economic stimulus as well as symbolic renewal. The technological challenges had been met with innovations that would benefit government operations for years to come. Software tools developed to manage the Cypher transition were being adapted for other large-scale government projects, while improved coordination protocols were being applied to everything from emergency response planning to international trade negotiations. Andrew Morrison, who had led the government's IT response to the transition, had documented best practices and lessons learned that would inform future projects requiring coordination between multiple departments and jurisdictions. The success of the Cypher transition had demonstrated that complex logistical challenges could be met through careful planning, clear communication, and commitment to excellence. The military dimension had been particularly significant. The Cypher transition had provided opportunities for the armed services to demonstrate their professionalism, attention to detail, and commitment to constitutional authority. The precision with which military units had updated their uniforms, equipment, and procedures had reminded the public of the high standards that characterized British military tradition. Colonel James Harrison of the Household Division had overseen the final ceremonial events that marked the completion of the military transition. The changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace now featured soldiers wearing uniforms that properly reflected the new reign, while maintaining the dignity and precision that made these ceremonies internationally recognized symbols of British excellence. The educational sector had used the transition as an opportunity to teach students about constitutional monarchy, Commonwealth relationships, and the practical challenges of large-scale organizational change. Schools throughout the United Kingdom had incorporated Cypher-related projects into their curricula, helping young people understand the institutions that shaped their society and the international relationships that defined their country's place in the world. Students at Winchester College have produced a documentary film about the Cypher transition that captured both its technical complexity and its human dimension. The film would serve as a historical record while demonstrating the educational value of engaging young people with real-world applications of classroom learning. The public response had been overwhelmingly positive, with opinion polls showing strong support for the way the transition had been managed. Citizens appreciated the efficiency and dignity that had characterized the process, seeing it as evidence of institutional competence in an era when many organizations struggled to manage far simpler changes effectively. Letters to newspapers and government departments had praised the attention to detail, the respect for tradition, and the seamless coordination that had made the transition virtually invisible to most citizens while accomplishing a massive undertaking. The contrast with other large-scale government projects that had experienced delays, cost overruns, and public criticism could not have been more stark. As King Charles III reviewed the final reports, he reflected on what the transition had revealed about the institutions he now led and the people who served them. The commitment to excellence, the attention to detail, and the quiet professionalism that had characterized every aspect of the project represented the best traditions of British public service. The Cypher transition had been more than a changing of symbols. It had been a demonstration of institutional strength, cultural continuity, and adaptive capacity that few organizations could have matched. The constitutional monarchy had shown that it could honor the past while embracing the future, maintaining standards while accommodating change. In post offices throughout the United Kingdom, citizens were seeing the new Cypher on stamps and official documents without giving it a second thought, which was exactly as it should be. The success of the transition could be measured by its invisibility to most people who continued to receive mail, interact with government services, and observe ceremonial occasions without disruption or confusion. Police officers wearing updated uniforms were continuing their duties with the same professionalism that had characterized their service under the previous Cypher. Military personnel were maintaining the same standards of excellence that had earned international respect for British Armed Forces. Civil servants were providing the same quality of service that had sustained democratic government through decades of political and social change. The Cypher transition had demonstrated that symbols matter, but that they derive their power from the institutions and people they represent rather than from their own inherent characteristics. The careful attention given to visual details reflected deeper commitments to accuracy, reliability, and respect for tradition that characterized the monarchy and the broader system of constitutional government. As evening fell over Windsor Castle, King Charles III walked through rooms that had witnessed 800 years of royal history, reflecting on his place in that long story. The Cypher transition was complete, but the work of his reign was just beginning. The efficiency and grace with which the transition had been accomplished provided a foundation for the challenges ahead, demonstrating that the institutions of constitutional monarchy retained the capacity to adapt and serve in contemporary circumstances. The new Cypher would serve for decades to come, appearing on countless documents, uniforms, and ceremonial items that would mark the passage of years and the evolution of British society. It would witness technological advances, political changes, and social developments that could not be anticipated, but it would do so as part of institutions that had proven their ability to maintain continuity while accommodating necessary adaptation. The transition was over, but its legacy would endure in the strengthened relationships between Commonwealth countries, the preserved craft traditions that have been applied to contemporary purposes, and the demonstration that careful planning and committed service could accomplish remarkable results. Most importantly, it had shown that the constitutional monarchy remained relevant, effective, and worthy of the respect it had earned through centuries of faithful service to the British people and the Commonwealth of Nations.